Africa, which filtered through to the many indigenous folks in the islands where they were transported, sadly, and used as labour. And their days would be simply slave labour, working 7 days a week, evil, under such strict labour. When they had free time, they would gather together in the evenings and they would sing songs using the rhythms and whatever basic instruments they would make, what they heard from their masters, the white Europeans or other influences, and they will create sounds originally driven by their West African roots, and they would named as I said, turn over Pocomania, Jocano, which is mostly of Jamaican origin, some mixed in there, Trinidad and Tobago, and Quadrille, which is a French folk mix of music, which is very much a St. Lucia monk, because St. Lucia is half French, half British, and other French islands and French mix like Dominica as well in the Women Islands. And they would then create little mini festivals when they were allowed, and that became the modern version of carnival. It was an opportunity to dress up and enjoy a moment of their culture, their lives amongst themselves. This became more relevant when emancipation was decreed from Britain first, Hispaniola later, although that was through reluctance from their behalf. And it became a regular event in all the islands of the Caribbean, from Jamaica right down to Trinidad and Guyana, British Guyana, that is, Guyana. And Calypso created a festival, a party, and no doubt you've all seen images of such as Trinidad and Tobago's Calypsos, which is one of the biggest and well-known in the Caribbean itself, world-renowned. Obviously Brazil has its most famous, because that is the biggest. That's been transposed here in the UK with the Notting Hill Carnival years later.
This weekend, isn't it? Notting Hill
Yes,
Carnival.
that's correct, yes. It's a celebration of their heritage. It's to get away from the horrible thing that they have to do day in, day out, and reflect on their culture, on their roots. West Africa. Hispaniola, Cuba, has its own as well. Cuba is a fantastic music resource. We think of Cuba as Castro, communism. Well, it is, but believe that, their musical heritage is unbelievable. And their heritage, their musical heritage, has seeped into Caribbean folklore, especially Jamaica, because Jamaica and Cuba are not all that far from each other logistically. So there were cross references, cross influences from island to island that seeped in, and particularly Jamaica with part of the Hispaniola musical influence, rhythm, brass actually.
I like the. It's funny because I always associate dub and reggae and early Caribbean music as quite simple, quite sparse, whereas Cuban, very intricate.
Very intricate, yes.
So
the basis of Cuban music is the brass, the wind instrument. Yes? That morphed over into Jamaica. But before we go into those early throes of what made Jamaica famous through its music content, a lot of young Jamaican men went to the panhandle of Florida and Louisiana, as far as New Orleans, to work on the sugarcane. When they arrived, this is, let's say, war, post-war, we're talking 1940, 1955-ish. I'm just doing a generalisation here. And these young Jamaican men were awestruck by the sound that was coming from local radio stations in the States. Because obviously New Orleans had its jazz, then it morphed into blues and vice versa. You had folk.
Any artists? Or
Sorry?
What artists?
Well, Louis Armstrong is the most influential man that came out of. But then you've got other artists, I can't think of their name straight away.
Around the area at the time.
Count Basie, obviously. that I was only listening to one the other day, but I just forgot his name now, from New Orleans. They had cross references of African and jazz and blues, because New Orleans has its own unique sound, as you know, rag. Right, it came from there. Then it splintered up into various sounds. It went across the Americas, especially in the southern states, and obviously eventually landed up in Chicago, Detroit, because it formed Motown, etc., years later. But it was the throes of R&B. And although I can't actually physically play it,
is what you today.
the Caribbean R&B classics. I'll pass this around. You can have a quick look. It's artists, black American artists, who were picking up sounds from Orleans, and Jamaicans who were working there picked this up as well. And the few vinyl was being produced in the Americas then. There were entrepreneurs who were producing field recordings of indigenous artists all through the Panhandle, right across to Orleans. And it kind of suddenly dawned on these young lads from Jamaica or Cuba, I like this sound, and they took these records back with them when they visited family and friends when they had the break from plantation work. And what they did, craftily, they rubbed out the label, the name, the artist. It could have been Joe Smith and his tenors from wherever part of the southern states. And they, in the case of one gentleman, a famous Jamaican by the name of Coxsone Dodd. I forgot his first name, Christian name. He's Seymour Dodd was his actual proper name, but he was known as Coxsone because Caribbean folk like to have nicknames. Again, it goes back to the African days. Coxsone. And he would bring lots of vinyls back in his suitcase, and he would scratch out the artists. They were unknown men and women singing, mostly men. And he would put Coxsone's version on it. And he would create his own little band. Years later, he formed Studio One, which was a world-famous studio that recorded many a famous tune that came across from Jamaica. But because of his visit to the Americas and coming back, and other men of his type, Duke Reid was another one and several others, they brought these vinyls back. We could copy that. Version is your name. Version. That's how it all started. Also, in Jamaica, because it was British colonialised, they could pick up radio signals of stations in the southern states. And the American DJs would play these American R&Bs, and Jamaicans were picking it up. Right? And they were hearing bits of it, those who had radios or wirelesses as it was known as then. And they were picking that up. This fascinated them. Because a lot of these DJs were going styling and profiling, our next journey is the man from the great sound. That's toasting over a sound. Right? You've heard of rap, which is today, talking, vibing over a tune or a rhythm. That's how it started. These were mistakes made by these DJs. They were rapping, talking over a tune at the start. That greatly influenced Jamaican young men, and these young men who were working in the plantations in the Southern America, who came back, created bands, created studios.